Hello, my friends. I'm Samantha, and welcome to the Sedge Circle podcast. I'd like to take a moment before we begin to remind you that if you like this podcast, please click the like button as well as subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. New episodes are uploaded almost every Friday, so if you don't see them in your notifications, you can always check back then. Now on to the show. This is something I have been mulling around in my head for some time. I have repeatedly written full podcasts on the subject, only to throw them in the trash and start over again. I have tirelessly thought about how I wanted to present this idea. I always want my message to come from a place of inspiration and hope, and not anger and frustration. I do not believe in pointing out an issue without offering a solution, or at least consulting with someone else who might know more than I do. However, I suppose this is a matter of opinion, and I'm not going to find someone who is more an expert on my opinion than myself. Here in America, we are doing something humans have been doing since the dawn of time. We are defining our spirituality. We are getting to know new gods and finding where we fit in within the cosmos. There is an interesting idea floating around the internet. Gods didn't make man, man made the gods. The first humans had gods, and those gods were reflections of those cultures' needs and experiences. If the crops needed rain, those cultures might call on a god of rain, and so forth. And many of those gods, dare I say, may be outdated today. They were conceived for the culture that needed them, and many of those needs are not relevant to our lives today. Christianity, for example, has many passages about how women are and should be subordinate. Why? Because that was a cultural norm at the time when the Bible was written. But we know this is an incredibly harmful and just flat wrong idea. Spiritual beliefs change over time. They have to. Everything has to evolve over time, or it will simply die out. And as we evolve, so do our gods. Now, I think it's safe to say you don't need gods or goddesses to practice witchcraft. Witchcraft, at its core, is secular. It is the craft of the wise, used by both men and women, healers and wise persons. On the same token, however, having a working relationship with gods, goddesses, or whole pantheons can be helpful in garnering an understanding of the forces of nature. The archetypes of nature, being gods, goddesses, elementals, and so on, exists for a reason. There are ways for us to make sense of the world. America is a relatively young nation, and we haven't had, nor, in many ways, do we seem to have the desire to create myths and legends, and why would we? We are in essence spiritually disconnected from the forces of nature in many ways. That's not to say these lands don't have their own myths and legends, those being the beliefs of the first peoples here, the Native Americans. But centuries of abuse and discord have caused many of these stories and practices to be closed practices, and rightfully so. Even with the abundance of information at our fingertips, there are still those who are not aware of how, for example, the practice of burning sage was illegal until the passing of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act in 1978. I completely understand the desire to protect these sacred practices. As I have said, I see the gods and goddesses as different ways to explain the natural happenings of life on this planet. Myths are a way for humankind to make sense of universal concerns such as life, death, the afterlife, and creation of the world. They are also a way to tell the tale of human experience. Chances are, if your ancestors immigrated to America, as mine did, they were Christians, which was the norm at the time. By that time, indigenous European beliefs had been suppressed and all but eradicated by conversion or force. However, it is very hard to remove spiritual superstition from an entire culture, and many of those superstitions followed those immigrants to America to be passed down through the generations. A good fictional description of this comes from the book American Gods by Neil Gaiman. In his book, he tells a tale of an Irish woman, if memory serves, Essie McGowan, or Tregowan in the novel, who would leave offerings to the Fae to receive their blessings. Essie continues this practice as an indentured servant, as well as telling the tales her grandmother told her to the children in the house she worked in. This may be a fictional example, but still an example nonetheless. There are many examples of cultural superstitions that have survived immigration. Making a wish on a wishbone dates back to ancient Italy, where it was believed chickens had divine powers by the Romans. Salt, at one point in history, was considered a precious commodity, and it was practically sacrilegious to spill it. Therefore, picking up the spilled salt and throwing it over your left shoulder was, and even is to this day, whether we know it or not, considered a sufficient way to banish evil spirits. And one of my favorite traditions that survived immigration is the Scandinavian tradition of leaving an offering of rice porridge out for the Nissi, or land spirits, on Christmas Eve, in hopes to keep their pranks to a minimum. But these are simply superstitions, and merely parts of a full spiritual belief system. And sadly, many of the old belief systems just are not applicable to the average life of the modern person. Many, if not most, of these religions were birthed well before the Industrial Revolution, when agriculture, the reason for many of our deities, myths, and legends in the first place, took a backseat to industrialization and urban life. It only makes sense we would begin to redefine our deities and folklore to match this new way of life. Believe it or not, there are even legitimate and even tax-exempt spiritual paths created around pop culture. After all, many of these franchises have deep cosmology, even going far back as to explain the origins of existence. And many of these stories mirror what we already established as myth and legends. They are simply reinterpreting common themes found in nature and mythology, the same way two artists would paint the same tree differently. These religions are what are called hyper-real religions, or religion based on a mixture of traditional concepts and pop culture. There are the Jedi, who tell of the Force, something that shares similarities to the East Asian Chi or Ki. Jediism has 3 tenets: focus, knowledge, and wisdom, and I'm fairly certain it would be hard to argue the importance of these things. There is the Elven spiritual path, modeled after J.R.R. Tolkien's cosmology. In Tolkien's cosmology, the universe was sung into being, which is quite interesting considering everything has a vibration, and these vibrations could easily be interpreted as a song. Discord came only when, out of jealousy and a thirst for power, Melkor sang out of harmony with the rest of the gods and goddesses, or Valar, as Tolkien called them. Disharmony can be attributed to many of our own struggles and suffering, and is a common theme in many older religions. There's also Dudism, modeled after the life of Jeffrey Lebowski in the film The Big Lebowski. Many of the books on Dudism explain Buddhist concepts through examples shown in the film itself, and has garnered quite a following. Jeffrey, or the Dude, is quite happy bowling and doing Tai Chi with his beverage of choice in hand. However, he is met with many different struggles throughout the movie, and despite these challenges, he is still able to come back to center. Eventually. These three examples of spiritual paths could be considered philosophies. However, there are many who truly believe them to be their true religious path. To me, these are good examples of unverified personal gnosis, commonly referred to as UPG, or a spiritual belief gained through the experience and not tradition or commonly accepted religious texts. I personally believe UPG to be an important part of the human spiritual evolution experience. However, it has its risks and downsides, as most things do. While UPG can be a wonderful way to deeply explore spirituality, it has also been used to further harmful ideologies like white supremacy, specifically in reconstructed Germanic and Nordic spiritual traditions. But I can't help but feel these are more power grabs as opposed to genuine spiritual interest and experience. As always, it's important to keep your wits about you, even while exploring the spirit. Though these alternative religions make up but a fraction of a % of the population, I feel UPG and these alternative spiritual paths will become more accepted and popular as humans seek to regain their connection to spirit and nature. Like our ancient ancestors, we will seek out archetypes that relate to us and make them a part of our modern spiritual practices. Truly, it's what we do. Spirituality is not something that needs to be proven through science, archaeology, and anthropology, unless, of course, you're attempting to recreate an exact replica of an ancient belief system, which, let's be honest, many of those practices would be illegal today, and probably not something we would want to do in the first place. In this life, I have chosen not to take the stories of the divine literally. I know there are many who do, and if you find this explanation offensive, I would remind you this is simply my opinion. It is my belief these forces of nature, whatever you name them or how you see them, are well beyond our capacity to define, and those definitions we have lent them are merely artistic expressions of our own understandings. That doesn't make them any less relevant or valid. It just makes them more personal. And personally, I have hope for these newer pop culture inspired paths. It has been my experience they are rooted in concepts of equality, wisdom, love, and personal growth, all without the cultural stipulations of religions past. But there is always room for corruption, so I suppose we'll just have to wait and see. The issue I was referring to at the beginning of this podcast is closed-mindedness. Admittedly, I have some pretty strange ideas, or ideas that are not strange to me, but I feel would be strange to others. Those ideas are some of the things that make up my own UPG. And I'm sure you may have some ideas you fear others would find strange. In the end, we're all just trying to make sense of this world we live in. But even those of us with what could be considered strange ideas judge the strange ideas of others. As I said, I don't like to pose a problem without offering a solution. So here is my solution. View others' perception of spirit as you would art. If you're looking at a painting, you may find things you like about it and things you don't. You may look at that painting and think, well, it's not for me, but I can see how the artist may have come to this conclusion. But you don't condemn it or judge it. You take it for what it is, something very personal, and move on, allowing that artist to continue to create without interference. Art and spirituality are both languages that express ideas. While there are certainly common themes, the minute details of both art and spirituality are personal and left to the interpretation of the individual. I think it goes without saying that if either art or spirituality is harming someone, then it is only right to call it into question. But be careful with labeling something as harm, because your perceived harm may stem from your own expectations. For example, a Christian might feel, because someone doesn't follow Jesus, that they are inflicting harm upon themselves, especially in the perceived afterlife. However, that would be perceived harm based on their own expectations. This idea of cultivating a new understanding of spirituality is not new, and I know I'm not the only person who has considered these things and felt the way I do. I would like to leave you today by reading an excerpt from the 1836 essay Nature by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should we not have a poetry of philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us and not the history of theirs? Embosomed for a season in nature, whose floods of life stream around and through us and invite us by the powers they supply to action proportioned to nature, why should we grope among the dry bones of the past, or put the living generation into masquerade out of its faded wardrobe? The sun shines today also. There is more wool and flax in the field. There are new lands, new men, new thoughts. Let us demand our own works and laws and worship. Until next time, my friends, I bid you all a very fond farewell until we meet again.